Hello, welcome again to the MBA interview podcast video. We're happy to have you here. My name is Dr. Jeffrey Darville. I'm the MBA director here at the American University in the Emirates. I'm also assistant professor of business and leadership. And today I'm happy to be joined by Dr. Alex Jones. He has his PhD in learning with a focus, in leadership with a focus on critical thinking and leadership in higher education, master's degree of international business. And he has extensive experience in business development, nationally and internationally, worked for worldwide organizations such as Macmillan and W.H. Freeman, Worth Publishers, as well as some entrepreneurship in his background, which I greatly respect. He started his own company. He's also worked as the academic dean, chief academic officer, and director of admissions and administration in San Diego, California. And one of his most important topics that he studied and researched and uses in his teaching as well is the concept of critical thinking. This term has become all the rage in a lot of education circles. It shows up in articles in magazines and newspapers and in news programs. Often we talk about how we want to increase the critical thinking of our students, whether it's at the K through 12 level or all the way up into higher education and master's degrees. So to get us started, I'd like to find out a little bit more about Alex, his background, but especially this idea of critical thinking. So if you could define for us the term critical thinking and what it means for education.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for having me on the show. I'm really excited to start this podcast and looking forward actually to continue on much more valued topics in this industry, in this field. You actually brought the attention to the topic that is really most important, most challenging, which is critical thinking. Critical thinking, it is a required skill required by most industries across the world nowadays. It's required by most educational institutions, whether schools, colleges, higher education in general. And the recent survey shows in the United States about 33% of newly fresh graduates, they lack in the critical thinking skills. If we look at this rate, is pretty high percentage of fresh new graduates who are lacking such an important skill. And if we look at it here carefully, that leads us to the conclusion that having a college degree nowadays is just not enough. Having a college degree just opens the doors to graduate from a certain program. Now, critical thinking, actually, it is the most required skill, as I said, in the 21st century. Now, it dates back to the ancient Greeks, to the age of 2,500 years ago. The Plato, Aristotle, and the ancient Greek philosophers used a concept, a very simple concept, which is lacking nowadays, unfortunately, in a human being, which is the concept of training the mind. What is the concept of training mind? If we ask ourselves, how many times do we train our minds on a daily basis? We really neglect this aspects in our daily life, and simply because we're busy with day-to-day activities, and that's what we call it routine nowadays. Now, we have to pay attention to the fact that critical thinking is a logical, reflective process. So what do we mean by a logical, reflective process? The logical, reflective process, basically, that it needs and requires a logical mind, a reflective mind. So the logical mind interpret things from a different perspective. They look at things from different angles. They look at things and investigate it based on solid evidence, based on science. And they don't draw a conclusion just immediately, but after looking at the evidence and look at the different angles existing in many facts, they look at it here and they say, well, now we can draw the conclusion based on a solid evidence associated with a certain amount of certain evidence that we collected in the field or information. Now, the reflective minds, all the time, when you ask a question, they try to explain things with clarity. Now, clarity, it is the most important part of critical thinking. It is an essential component of critical thinking. Now, the logical mind investigates. The logical mind is basically evaluate analyze, and judge things. Now, we have to be careful here between judging and drawing conclusions. So, making a judgment and drawing a conclusion, there is a fine line between them. Now, when you draw a conclusion, the conclusion usually comes after making a solid judgment. And this is part of the critical thinking skills. Now, a lot of people, they say, oh, now I made a conclusion about a certain aspect of life or a certain thing that happens on their daily life. But the reality is here, you're evaluating the things and you're judging it. But here, you're not judging it based on a valid conclusion. Before you draw that conclusion, you have to make sure you analyze, you evaluate, you look at the different aspects of it, and then you judge it based on that conclusion that is filled and rich with a lot of information and knowledge.
That's a really great point, Alex, and I'm glad that you bring this up because I think that many students and really workers, I think the World Economic Forum rated critical thinking as one of the top 10 skills that are needed in the workforce for the 21st century. So as you describe this, I'm thinking what we're trying to do is help students learn the process of critical thinking rather than the end result of making the judgments, because if you get the process right, based on additional experience in your life and the industry that you're in, you can apply this skill to any field. And you'll improve the outcomes of those decisions and the work that you're doing with your coworkers for sure.
Absolutely, and that leads me to the definition of Richard Paul, to be honest with you. That's one of the beautiful critical thinking definition that comes into mind right now. Richard Paul defines critical thinking as, critical thinking is thinking about your thinking while you're thinking in order to make your thinking better. How beautiful is this definition, to be honest? Now, when we look at it here, that leads us to the realization critical thinking is a cognitive skill. And the cognitive skill is using the brain, which leads us back to what ancient Greek philosophers used to do, is using the mind and training the mind. And that is the most neglected skill nowadays that's in any human being, which is training the minds to accept other people's opinion. How many times do we accept people's opinions if we look at it carefully? Not really many often, because when somebody criticizes us, they will say, oh, wait a second, I am not accepting that. I am basically, don't think you're better than me, and so many thoughts going into our minds. But here it is. If I say something to you and you accept it from an open perspective, and the idea here is you're training your mind to accept other people's opinion.
This is a very important point as well. So often when we hear the word critical, we think of criticizing or being criticized. Yes. And the term critical doesn't necessarily mean you're offending somebody or you're attacking their ideas. It's the real term when we talk about a critique for a movie or a play, or if you're critiquing an article, you're doing critical analysis. So it's meant to describe the process of pulling things apart into their smaller parts and understanding, as you say, the evidence in order to build towards a valid conclusion.
You said it quite well, basically, and the idea here is if we open our minds and our hearts to accept other people, that itself is critical thinking. And most of the time, when somebody says something to us, this is what happens. If it does not have enough clarity, we just assume things. And assuming things that is based not on solid evidence is not critical thinking. It's basically assuming things without solid evidence. It's definitely tells you you're not a critical thinker by itself. Now, a lot of us nowadays, you ask a person, are you good in critical thinking? Do you do critical thinking even inside a classroom, in organizations? You ask anybody, are you a good critical thinker? They say, yes, absolutely. But the reality here, ask a question that is vague question. Are they going to ask you back for clarity? Which really rarely happens nowadays. So clarity, although it's an essential component, but when we are willing to accept other people's opinion and we're willing to be criticized, and because most of the times when somebody criticizing us, we tend to take it negatively. But the reality here, maybe somebody is criticizing you, just want to make your ideas much better.
Right.